So I'm afraid I haven't thought up another fruity analogy for community energy resilience, because it is a very serious issue, and we have, I think it's something like 200,000 people in Victoria still off from yesterday. So it's a serious, serious issue. So in this session, we're going to explore community energy resilience. And I think the conversation around community energy resilience kicked off after the 2019-2020 bushfires. The ECA did a really good report on Malakuta's experience, and that showed that perhaps big, chunky, sexy network batteries were not necessarily the answer, because there's only so much energy you can have in a battery, and the community weren't entirely sure what that battery was going to do. And as we've seen in Victoria following yesterday's extreme heat and storms, we urgently need to think about what energy resilience looks like and how it might be delivered. Now, I'm a climate scientist, and I can tell you that events like yesterday, indeed the Queensland floods, the Lismore floods, and the bushfires are going to be more frequent. A hotter atmosphere is one that holds a lot more water and energy, and that will fall on us as water, storms and wind. But as we saw in the previous session, we are electrifying. And what does that mean? If everything is electrified, how are we going to be resilient? And that seems like a huge problem. And it is a challenge. For instance, yesterday in Victoria, there were no trains, there was no mobile network, there was no NBN network, and there was no electricity. So it all falls apart pretty quickly. However, the recent storms on the Sunshine Coast demonstrated how, with new technology, the EVs, the batteries, the solar PV that make up CER, that we've all been excitedly talking about today, can be our biggest friend during bad weather. There was a man, it's always a man, and we heard that in the earlier session, with a very sceptical wife who insisted that they should invest in rooftop solar, a stationary battery, and an EV. And she wasn't entirely sure that that was a good idea. However, when they lost power in the Sunshine Coast and it was out for several days, he was able to keep his family cool because he was able to run his air conditioning. And because his EV was fitted with vehicle to load, he not only helped his family, he went around the community and helped people open their gates or whatever they needed. And so this new technology offers an opportunity to provide resilience. So perhaps one of the solutions is that it's small and beautiful rather than big and sexy. But of course, you need to set up your community energy, your CER correctly. If you just install solar and you haven't got the right inverter, or you haven't got a battery, or you haven't got an isolation switch, I'm afraid it all stops working when there's no electricity network. And that proper setup may cost you extra in terms of kit and the technicians to do it. Now, last year, I did speak about apples, and I pitted the big apple system against the apple trees in the backyard. But the reality is that if we do want a resilient supply of electricity as climate changes, all of us that have apples or have a role in moving apples around will need to work together, because in the end, community energy resilience is about the relationships and communities at all levels. So me, my neighbours, my community, local government, state government, federal government, working together to deliver resilience, because resilience can't be done in isolation. So now I'd like to introduce a video, a short video on Venus Bay and their community resilience efforts led by Heather Smith.
Communities know what they want and need. Often the systems in place don't support that. This project is exciting because it enables a community-led and designed approach.
A model that can be used in other communities that could also be world-leading. the practical reasons for supporting a project to get a permanent and reliable power supply at Venus Bay are huge.
We've all been on septic, tank water, lots of us are on solar, we're often dealing with power outages, we haven't had good phone reception. The aim is to work out what actually makes sense for this community.
There may be a range of options. There might be a whole roadmap of things that we can do, from having a hub like we have here, a community centre cluster, if you like, to some other clusters and eventually join everything up. Who knows? But we need a community understanding and the opportunity for them to have a say.
So the community centre really is a driver of listening to what the community wants, getting some funding together and creating some sort of project to address whatever that challenge is. Not everyone's able to engage in the same way. You know, a lot of people want to just chat about it. They might want to read about it. So we need to make sure in this project we've got multiple ways that people can feel involved and have their say. We've got one road in and out, we've got high fire danger, we are dependent on electricity.
We all depend on power, not just for all the things that you run off power, but also for water, because we've all got pumps. When you haven't got power, you haven't got heating, you haven't got lighting, and increasingly you sort of don't have communication either.
We decided to really respond to the more regular outages that we were experiencing. We had a plan to make this community centre a centre of resilience. In times of power outages, this place has power for those essential needs. People can come and use the toilets, get water, charge their devices. That was one of the first steps in what we're hoping is a much bigger project.
It's your expertise we need today. You live here, you know this place. Resilience is to be found largely in relationships. And we see that in the reflection of Energy Consumers Australia about the Mallacoota bushfires. We see it in the expert panel that the Victorian government set up to look at the 2019 bushfires. All of those pieces of work said, electricity networks, you need to understand that the resilience is between people on the ground when the thing happens. And you need to create relationships with the communities you serve. And you need to understand how those communities work together.
All right. So I'd like to now, we just saw Heather speaking there on the video, so I'd like to introduce Heather, who is the chair of the Coalition for Community Energy and an electrical engineer who is frantically writing her PhD thesis on redesigning the electricity grid with microgrids. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks so much, Jill. And my first dot point can get crossed off because you've just watched that bit. But Venus Bay did come to me, spooked by what had happened in Mallacoota. We think we want a microgrid, and I suggested they maybe start a little bit smaller and help suggest the Venus Bay Community Centre battery and expanded solar system. And they've gone on to they're part of an electric bus trial, so that's actually now powering their local transport as well. So I do want to double down on that relationships idea. This is the framework. It's built on an international framework that we used, and I modified it a little bit. What you start to understand, the very first session that we did was actually mapping those relationships with people, between people, with the systems. You know, when an event happens, does anyone in your community know who to call in the DNSP? Does anyone have contacts in the telcos and who in local government's going to help you? Because none of those organisations are on the ground. And of course, that's what the expert panel in Victoria was saying. Look, lots of people stepped up immediately when the Mallacoota bushfires happened, and they made stuff happen together in their community based on the relationships they had between each other. But it's more than just the relationship of people, because it's the organisations you've already built in your community, and we quickly identified that all of our organisations in Venus Bay worked out of Tarwin-Lower, because Tarwin-Lower is the service town. So we had to change the name of our project to Community Energy for Venus Bay and Tarwin-Lower. And we also deep dive on what are these infrastructure relationships? What's our relationship to the infrastructure? So technology's not just a thing. We relate to it. We use it. We have increasing electrification in our lives since the 50s. You know, when they promoted all electric suburbs in Adelaide back in the 50s, that was so people could have a fridge for the first time or whatever. And so you have this, how much of our stuff relies on electricity, and this interaction with telcos. As you saw in the video, telecommunications was a really important element of resilience in this community, and we haven't solved it yet. I want to point to step 5 in the framework. The other thing we emphasised was that of all the things that can happen, bounce back better and collapse are the two things that really relate to the system learning and changing. Collapse is not ideal, but sometimes collapse is what leads to the change you want. And Mr. Anti-Fragile, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he writes about the way many small shocks make a system stronger because every time it learns. That was one of the first things Venus Bay said to us was, we are a resilient community. Don't make us feel like we're a vulnerable community. And part of that's because they regularly have blackouts. They have 3-day blackouts. They have strategies to deal with 3-day blackouts. I want to touch quickly on, we did an exercise mapping what's essential, what's enough, what's everything. What are your diverse ways of serving that need, like heating and water, if your electricity fails? And we had answers like, well, I can always go out to my car and charge my phone there. We estimated 25 to 30% of everyone's electricity use falls into that essential category. So there's a challenge there for us as a society to think about, if serving essential needs is what people need during emergencies and during outages, that's a lot cheaper to provide than saying to the DNSPs, you've got to improve your 100% reliability. And just leaving on my last point, I would say our biggest challenge still is relationships with the infrastructure providers. So despite the DNSPs having an order from the Victorian government or a recommendation saying you need to work out how to work with communities, we had so much trouble finding someone who wanted to talk about our project, interact with us, meet our community. I've been chasing for 18 months someone I could talk to in Telstra or NBN who could actually explain what infrastructure we have on the ground and how we could survive. And remember, this is a community that has a planned outage for electricity one day, and half an hour later they get an unplanned NBN outage, and you scratch your head and go, what were we meant to know about that, and how can we do something about it? And finally, you know, just to point out how communities can do things. In Malakuta, in the wake of the fires, the Community Energy group there know about how people were trained locally to use the AusNet services or interact with the AusNet services system. We know in Totally Renewable Yakandanda, they've gone round after years and years of building their relationships with emergency services to expand their batteries and solar systems and put in connections for emergency generators. So community energy groups are filling a gap there where it's not happening for them and it's not obviously no one's obviously coming to help their particular situation. So I think I'll leave it there. How'd I go?
Thank you, Heather. So our next panel member is Dr. Scott Dwyer, who works at the Institute for Sustainable Futures here at the University of Technology, Sydney, and he's working on the opportunities and challenges faced by consumers by the fundamental changes in the energy system, and he's going to talk a little bit about the ECA project that he worked on.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. So we worked on a project that was looking to develop a tool, a resource for communities to help them with community energy resilience. And it was a bit unusual in the way we approached this project, because we started off saying, well, we don't know actually what this guide is going to look like. We don't know what the toolkit will look like. This is part of the process that we'll go through, speaking to communities, looking at what's out there, and developing the resource based on this. So, yeah, you just see a sample of the resultant guide, which kind of looks like Monopoly or Pictionary or Cards Against Humanity or something. So it's doing a lot of what Heather showed you there with Venus Bay and the great work they've been doing, but acknowledging the fact that we've only got one Heather, and there's, and it takes a long time to work through those processes with the community to understand what resources are on the ground, what energy assets they have, what makes that community unique, and how they can respond in some of those situations. So this guide was really around making it easy to have all the information there around what they could do, how they can go through that mapping process in terms of their energy assets, and also recognizing it's a continual process of transformation as well, where people move into areas. We know there's been a big change in the demographics in the last few years. Lots of people moving into areas where they're at risk or have been affected by extreme weather. And again, how do you build their knowledge and capacity and capability based on the existing knowledge of people in the community and what they've gone through? So just to give a quick run through how we approached this as well, was really looking first off at what is community energy resilience. And there's lots of definitions and quite established for community energy, for energy resilience, for community resilience, but there was that bit of gap there around what is meant by community energy resilience. And after looking at the literature and the various guides and realizing that there was a gap there for something that was really consumer focused, and I'll just read the definition as well, because I think it'll just help framing it. And so there's a lot of work behind getting this, getting the definition correct, so I'll just butcher it if I try and memorize it. So the definition is a community with the capacity and resources to adopt and utilize local appropriate energy solutions that help to learn, anticipate, withstand, and quickly recover from climate disasters. So again, you can see how that ties into a lot of what we've heard in the work in Venus Bay around what assets are there, what knowledge is there, how can we use things like the neighbour's vehicle to load EV, who needs it first, how can you use those communication systems that are there if it's sending, running down the neighbour's house, who needs it most. So that was our starting point, and then through the project as well, going into communities, working with the Community Power Agency, went to 6 communities in 3 different states, affected by cyclones, bushfires, floods. 3 of them were badly affected, 3 of them were at risk, and doing workshops in each of those communities to understand, okay, what do they think about when they hear about community energy resilience? What do they need to know to be able to have those conversations with emergency services, with the different levels of government, with each other, and then really using the findings from those workshops to feed into what would they really want from a guide or a toolkit. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Scott. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Klerck. He's worked at the Tangentyere Council Aboriginal Corporation for over 15 years and has published some recent work on the poor energy outcomes of remote communities in Northern Territories, where a lack of regulation and a dominance of poor housing combined with prepaid meters holds communities back in an energy sense. Michael.
Thank you. I should acknowledge that I was only one of several co-authors on that work, and so it was a good collaboration with team members at Tangentyere, but also ANU as well. Just thinking about what to say here today. At the moment in the Northern Territory, there's over 7,500 households with prepayment meters. Predominantly, those are outside the regulated networks in the National Partnership Agreement for Remote Housing NT footprint. But there's also about 2,000 households in regional centres like Alice Springs, both in urban public housing and also in town camps. The issue with prepayment meters is multifaceted really, and far too much stuff to explore today. But thinking about this from the perspective of Energy Consumers Australia, thinking about consumers, at the moment prepayment meter customers are largely invisible because the relationship between the retailers in the NT is almost directly with the prepayment meter itself rather than with the prepayment meter customers. It's not an entirely Northern Territory issue. Nationally, there's about 15,500 households with prepayment meters. Predominantly, these are in remote and regional parts of the NT, Queensland, WA and South Australia, and they're predominantly in either remote Aboriginal communities or community living areas. Disconnection rates back in back in 2018, 2019, across the National Partnership Agreement footprint of about 3,300 houses with smart meters. So these are not the full 5,700 houses, but those with smart meters. Disconnection rates self-disconnection impacted 91% of households, and 75% of households self-disconnected more than 10 times in that year. Self-disconnection is when people don't have the resources or ability to basically top up their meters. By 2019-20 in Alice Springs, where there's 578 prepayment meters, the disconnection rate was up to, for the average house, was up to 55 times per annum, and the average disconnection event was 7 hours and 42 minutes. At the moment, like a lot of the protections that exist for post-payment or account customers don't exist for prepayment customers. And also a lot of the opportunities don't exist. So for example, there's no standing offer for solar. Tangentyere and others, have advocated for and persevered to the point where there's a few PV systems connected to prepayment meters, but not many. Prepayment tariffs are slightly higher than post-payment tariffs. Anyone that's using more than an average of 20 kilowatt hours a day is paying more for their power. But when you think about it, like a disconnection of power, a self-disconnection of power impacts, we all, through the National Indigenous Housing Guide, we talk about safety and the 9 healthy living practices. All that health hardware, most of that health hardware can't function with power. And in the NT, unlike the rest of the country, the minimum NAIDER's star rating for new houses is only 5 stars. In Alice Springs, on the town camps, where 71 houses, 44 replacements and 27 new builds have been constructed since 2022, the average NAIDER's rating is 5.3 stars, so that's not terribly efficient, and I would say that the housing stock is a lot less efficient. But this work continues, research continues to try and highlight a problem which has been largely invisible. There's been some engagement with the Commonwealth. We had a meeting on one of the town camps with Ministers Bowen and McAllister on the 18th of May last year, where it was pointed out that there was a PV system on the roof of the community centre connected to a prepayment meter. It was also pointed out that these two new houses here. That one was 5 stars and that one's 5.1 stars. But there was also a press conference that day where it was that 300 million that was being talked about for the upgrade of social housing. There was a press conference and the Minister said a lot of great stuff about the potential for PV systems connected to prepayment meters on the roofs of that town camp. But I would say that prepayment meter disconnection is a significant issue right throughout the NT and other parts of the country. And the visibility of those individuals in those households, needs to be at the forefront of everyone's minds. Prepayment meters are there to provide a service to prepayment meter customers who live in houses in a climate which is, our interest as a research team really started with the rollout of smart meters, in 2018-19, which also happened to be a summer where there was 59 days over 40 degrees and 129 days over 35 degrees. And that was absolutely a grassroots initiative from our members wanting to explore those issues. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So now I'd like to introduce Rob McLeod, who heads up Renew's policy and advocacy team, as well as Renew's Climate Resilient Homes campaign. Rob was awarded the ECA 2023 Jill Owens Scholarship, and he got to travel to Spain to explore the approach they take to extreme heat over there versus perhaps what we do here. Rob.
Thanks very much, Jill, and thanks very much, everyone, for the chance to speak with you all. With the support of ECA, I have had the chance to work on researching the responses to heatwaves in Spain, and I'd like to thank them for that. The situation in Spain and their recent experiences really do put them at the intersection of existing climate impacts and pressures on energy systems. The last couple of years particularly have seen some really, really severe conditions. So 2022 globally was the hottest year ever recorded, surpassed by 2023. In Spain, these have been the two of the hottest years ever recorded as well, and they've actually had much higher temperature increases than anywhere else in the region. They're also facing a range of other threats from issues like desertification, severe droughts, and extreme heat events. So tracking the number of days of heatwave conditions that they're experiencing, it's expanded significantly. Madrid's faced more days of heatwave conditions in the last 2 years than they did in 20 years in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And that's pretty similar across the country. The impacts of that are really severe when it comes to health. Then people die. In 2022, 15,000 people were found to have died as a result of heat conditions. And those impacts aren't evenly spread. It's people who have lower incomes with lower resources, particularly older people, older women especially, and people with pre-existing conditions who are most likely to face the impacts of extreme heat. And that's a similar picture to what we have here in Australia. In the case of Spain, they've also had this happening at the same time as massive pressures on the energy system. So in 2022, in the lead up to and particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, energy prices has skyrocketed. A large part of that was because of access to gas, of course, and the broader European-wide and global situation, but also the impacts of drought on hydroelectricity, and a range of other things as well. And they had to take some really, really significant measures to reduce the impacts on both consumers and more broadly across the system. So they did a lot of things to, both in terms of consumer protections, they exited the European energy market essentially to introduce a price cap similar to what we put in here in Australia. And accelerated the shift towards renewables more broadly. And, that's staggeringly fast. 5 years ago, coal made up about 20% of electricity in the Spanish market. Now it's 2% because they're really steaming forward when it comes to renewables. But one of the things about this is that they also needed to reduce the demand on electricity. They needed to take measures to reduce overall demand, and particularly with the relation to gas in the electricity system. They introduced demand reduction measures that included on cooling specifically. So they introduced a law that banned cooling in public spaces using air conditioners below the temperature of 27 degrees. So 27 degrees was the lowest you could put a thermostat in summer, and this coincided with the historically most significant hot summer that they've ever experienced. Similarly, homes themselves actually are less dependent on air conditioning than we are here in Australia. So about, depending on where you look, about 75% of Australian homes have air conditioning, whereas it's about 35% in Spain. And it's even in the hottest parts, it's still less than we have here in Australia. They've taken a lot of steps in both the short term in terms of immediate responses to heat waves. So they have a national strategy for immediate responses. They do a lot of public communications. Seville became the first country in the world to start naming heat waves. So in the same way that we name cyclones, we have Cyclone Yazi. They have heat wave Yago, heat wave Vera. They had 4 named heat waves over the course of this most recent year. But at the same time, there's also a lot of other longer-term things that they're thinking about, because it's one thing to be responding in the moment, but the resilience agenda has to go beyond just a response to immediate conditions. And while that immediate response is critically important, and people in Victoria understand that very, very well today, there also has to be a long-term adaptation strategy, and that's what they're really emphasising. And so there's by 2026 they're on track to upgrade or rehabilitate over 500,000 homes for energy efficiency, and with a focus on energy resilience. There's a lot of urban. We can get into details in conversation if people are interested, but a lot of focus on urban greening, urban design, reducing urban heat island effects and traffic. Also, critically working towards what a lot of people over there talk to me about as a heat culture. So not just the physical infrastructure, not just homes, not just poles and wires, but also all of the intangible things and all of the shared understandings about how we can best respond to heat, how people can remain resilient, and the shared practices that need to be built in as a measure alongside all of the physical things that need to happen. I just conclude my comments by saying that they're tracking it and it is working. So Spain is adapting to extreme heat, and the medical research there is showing that the temperature at which people start to die, the mortality starts to increase in Spain, is actually rising by about 0.6 degrees a decade. The temperature that it takes to start resulting in deaths is actually going up. The challenge that they face, while that's the good news, the bad news is that temperatures themselves are actually also going up, and that's by about 0.4 degrees per decade. And so they're in a race against time. It's like being on a treadmill that you just can't stop running, because if you do stop doing all of those measures that they're taking to adapt, then the consequences will be severe, will be catastrophic. And so the pressure is on, and it's something that I think that we need to take very seriously here in Australia. I would note that that is the picture that we are facing over the decades to come as well, and we do need to be looking at these examples.
Thank you, Rob. So I'll ask a couple of questions of each panel member. So I'm going to start with Michael. Is there any technical, physical reason why you can't have solar PV with your prepayment meter, or is it just a retail tariff offering issue?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There is no reason why you can't have PV connected to a prepayment meter. In Alice Springs, for example, people with prepayment meters have got Liberty 120 smart meters, which are exactly the same as the meters on post-payment households. And in fact, prepayment meters were upgraded to smart meters before most residential households were upgraded. So in fact, they were really prepared for solar before, most households. There's several reasons, it seems. I think one is about going back to that issue of the anonymity of people living in prepayment households, the relationship between the retailers with the prepayment meter. So even being able to do things like, topping up your meter with centre pay deductions or direct debits isn't really an option. And so therefore, what happens when you have a PV system on a roof when it comes to the potential for exports? So in a sense, at this stage, it is just a roadblock that can be addressed with a change of policy.
Yeah.
Is my feeling.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Heather, you've talked about critical infrastructure providers and relationships. You've also talked in the past about relationships with your local emergency services as well. So can you talk a little bit about how the relationships in the community also impact the ability to deliver resilience?
So just to give the emergency services a bit more context, we had real trouble bringing the CEFS, CFA volunteers into the community energy project because everyone's really busy. And everyone does lots of volunteer work in small communities. Totally Renewable Yakandanda reflected that it probably took them 5 years to bring their CFA around, and by that stage they'd finally convinced them to put solar on the roof and add a battery. So that was one area where we couldn't engage. And the local government there have an emergency management group that meet regularly with an AusNet services provider, an NBN person and a Telstra person. But because we weren't running an emergency management agenda, we were running a longer term conversation. And as some of the work I've seen around community resilience, not community energy resilience, but community resilience, is framed in that emergency management language, and it's expected that people like community groups like Red Cross perhaps, and other groups that respond or do recovery around emergencies would be most interested in doing planning for emergencies and planning for recovery. And so we had real trouble connecting those two agendas together. You know, here we are running an energy conversation about how energy technology is changing, and if we think about the ways diversity and many options give us different ways to provide energy, because now there are hundreds of solar panels in a community, not just one big line bringing electricity in, and in future there might be hundreds of batteries in a community as well. So the diversity's coming along, but the technology's all tangled. We're trying to have that conversation. Emergency management is having a different conversation, and we're struggling to bring the two together.
Yeah, thank you. Scott, so I know you worked with communities. Did you have similar sorts of issues in trying to bring communities together to talk about community energy resilience and developing the toolkit?
Yeah, so our approach to the community engagement workshops, as I said, we had 6 different workshops, 2 in New South Wales, 2 in Queensland, 2 in Victoria, with one community having been affected and one at risk. So our project partners, Community Power Agency, they ran the workshops, and I know every community is different. Some were easier to get a good mix of community members, a good mix of organisations and agencies. Others were more difficult. Some had already mobilised around community energy initiatives. Others hadn't. So I think it's a real mix. But what we learned from the whole project, and we were reflecting on at the end, is just the importance of that collaboration between the different networks and agencies, and really working together on strategies that work, and whether that's the strategies with, again, what resources do you have in is it solar and batteries? What communication infrastructure can you commandeer? What is the built environment? Where can you go and what energy assets and buildings can you actually use, and who are and who's best to really inform that. So I think that the network businesses, I see a question there. The network businesses should definitely be involved. The emergency services, the local government, any other agencies, the community groups that are already active. But I think that's the key, is really getting that collaboration across all agencies and really working on those strategies together.
Thank you. Rob, there's been some work, so for instance in Phoenix on hot days they pull up buses and they've got the aircon running and people can go into the buses, and in the UK over winter they opened libraries for the opposite problem for cold, and councils provided sort of spaces where you could go and warm up. Is that, it sounded like public spaces for cooling was not an option in Spain?
So it's a varied picture across the country, and it's a very decentralised system. But absolutely, it is a big part of the focus of both a lot of municipal strategies and the national strategy. So there's a national strategy that kicks in at a certain threshold when heat waves are coming in during summer months. That provides advice to cities and towns all around the country, saying that now is the time that you need to activate X, Y, and Z thing, including more cool spaces, including health teams for people who are sleeping rough, including a lot of other measures like that. It's not universally applied, and there are gaps to who can access this. There are, for example, and sometimes there are real conflicts over resources. So, people in Seville are very concerned about the impact of the growing presence of tourism, which is really important for the city, but it is also meaning that a lot of spaces which once upon a time were public pools or public spaces are becoming less accessible for people who are most in need of cool spaces. And that points to an issue which I think is not simply a Seville issue. That's a more broad issue around who is protected and who has access to public spaces in times of hot weather.
Thank you. Right, we're going to look at some questions from the floor now, so if you've not posed your question, now is the time to pose your question and get up voting. They're changing rapidly. So I think this is a question for Michael. Are there any genuine advantages of prepayment meters over standard accumulation or smart meters? What would be the implications of a blanket ban on prepayments be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I watched that pop up, so I tried to think about it. So I guess, for one thing, basically whether the meter's being used as a prepayment meter or being used as an accumulation meter, it's the same meter. But in terms of prepayment, at the moment what we've got in terms of prepayment is, I feel like there's not much visibility about what's happening, and there's also just no options for people. So the way that prepayment currently works is a problem. So if you're John Smith and you live in a house wherever, if you're living on a house in an urban Alice Springs or in a town camp in Alice Springs, your only option for putting some credit on that meter is to go to a retailer. Technically, if you've got a credit card and you've got access to the internet, you can go online if you know both your national meter indicator and your meter number. So really no one's doing that. It's ridiculous. No one knows their NIMI. Unless you're getting an account statement which has a NIMI on it. But also, there's just no option. So a lot of people have said, through the conduct of our conversations and research, that if people had the option of having if they could set up a regular deduction from their bank account or their centre pay payments, that they would do that to try and basically to run it like a true prepayment meter, topping it up as you go. At the moment, what's happening is that there's a couple of safeguards in place, and they're not very good. One's friendly credit. So if it's outside of 9 a.m. to 4 p.m, your meter won't disconnect. But the problem is that if, let's say, you get to 5 o'clock on a Friday and your credit runs out, like you've got no credit, then you run into friendly credit. You have to put credit back on the meter to reconnect at 9 o'clock on Monday. So we don't necessarily think that banning, there's a lot of people like prepayment as an option. It just needs to be something that looks something more like an account where the person isn't there's no anonymity, there's means of putting money onto the account without physically going into the shop. So I think that there needs to be somewhere between a middle ground, because at the moment in the NT, we've got two options that aren't necessarily great for a lot of people: prepayment and account, which isn't necessarily great for low-income households that favour prepayment. There needs to be something in between, and there needs to be rooftop solar on these houses as well.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question here on how distribution networks and communities can collaborate for a push to change in the economic framework for proactive investment in resilience. That's a toughie, because one of the New South Wales networks took a particular approach to delivering resilience that wasn't well supported by the regulator. So it's a big problem, and so I'm going to kind of subtly twist this question. is there a regulatory or policy and or both problem, this is to everyone, to progressing community energy resilience?
I have opinions.
Of course you have an opinion. You go for it, Heather, but we do need to allow everyone else to have a chance.
So I think the incentive is around, we know reliability is very unevenly spread across communities, and the incentive for networks is to spend money on getting all the power back on as fast as possible. There's no mechanism for spending the money on investments, distributed energy investments. And for a community like Venus Bay, that might eventually suit. It's a microgrid, not to be permanently off-grid, but to be sometimes off-grid, might suit a community like Venus Bay, especially if the microgrid was only sized to do 80% of what they need when they need it. There's no way for the DNSP to be recognised for backing back on its delivery of reliability so that it can spend the money on the microgrid instead, right? Or make some trade-offs with the community. Because remember, essential might be, I personally have my essential needs powered up here now, or it could be, I have access to power somewhere and my whole community has access to adequate power and everything I need in that moment. So there's different ways of cutting and dicing this. So it has to be about how resources flow, whether they come straight out of reliability stats. If anyone here wants to explain to me what STIPUS is and how it works, I'm here for that conversation. But yeah, there's something we need to talk about, because 99.99% reliability, or whatever it is not people's experience where they genuinely want to do something about their reliability.
Any other members of the panel on policy around resilience? No thoughts. I obviously have thoughts so I'm going to share some of my thoughts, even though I'm the chair. I do not think that our regulatory framework helps community energy resilience. I think networks are doing the best they can do in the framework that they've got. They struggle when they try to say, we know that we've got this big problem coming, like the kind of severe weather we saw in Victoria yesterday, but the regulator wants to know, is that going to happen in year 3 of your 5-year period? Year 4.5? Or can we push that event into year 6 so we can pretend we don't need to worry about it in this 5-year period? And that's not going to be very helpful, because we don't know when it's going to happen. We can't predict when it's going to happen. And that whole, should we pay for rebuilding after the event, or should we pay for some risk reduction before the event, or a resilience measure, is something that we really need to start thinking seriously about. Michael?
I mean, and that's if you've got a regulator as well. Like, if you're talking about the vast proportion of the NT, there is no regulator. And if you're thinking about closing the gap target 9B, then the latest Productivity Commission report, speaks volumes by saying there's really no data to measure that, the progress on that gap. So not only do we have a gap, but we also have a knowledge gap as well. So, yeah, the infrastructure, not just the essential infrastructure, but also the municipal infrastructure, and then other things as well. You look at transport disadvantage, or, other related things that potentially mitigate partially against, energy insecurity, are also lacking as well. But yeah, there's no regulation for the most of the NT anyway. And even in the parts of the NT where there is regulation, parts of the regulated networks don't meet those standards either. So,
yeah. So we've got a question here around, if you've had a severe weather event, let's say it's a flood, and you're rebuilding houses to accommodate future flooding, are you also thinking about the energy resilience, or are you really just thinking about how I'm going to keep this house out of the next lot of water? Do we need to think more broadly about when we're building back a community after an event? What are the things we should be considering?
Yeah, so Heather alluded to it in that disaster framework, and in our Energy Ready guide as well, we talked a lot about bouncing forward and building back better, and thinking, okay, if you've got your, if you're building back the housing infrastructure, there's obviously other infrastructure around that. What does that look like in terms of the local electricity network? What does that look like in terms of the other community assets? And I think it's a good opportunity to look and reassess and say, okay, what actually makes sense here in terms of the other infrastructure that you're putting in. If you're doing the houses anyway, there's a great chance to take it and assess that. But again, the different agencies, the network businesses, and the community should be part of that discussion.
I would add that you need to make sure you've thought about it beforehand, because when you're just in that moment, it's a bit like you're replacing your hot water story. You're urgently trying to do it. And if you haven't sort of done some of the thinking about, there will be a time that comes when I need to put all these things in place, you're not going to do it in the moment of rebuilding a community because so much is going on.
Yeah, so it's all a distress purchase. So it all has to be there, ready to go when the distress happens. And I guess it takes a long time once you start factoring in insurers and all those kind of things as well. We have a question for Rob on heat culture in Spain. Can you tell us what that might look like? What would heat culture in Australia look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's an emerging concept that I think is trying to grapple with the problem that it's not just a case of physical, it's not just a case of, having the right buildings, having the right energy system. Yep, that's important. But there is so much more to the picture that has the more intangible assets. And that could be as simple as a shared understanding of daily practices, how you're shading a home, how you're using your home when you're opening the windows and when you're not, when you're checking in for your neighbours. Famously, it involves the siesta and an entire different scheduling way of doing things. Like that is an example that has been cited as an example of living in a different way as a result of this program. There are people who are working on programs to try and build, that are really emphasising this, to try and build this up, and that includes doing things like workshops for at the community and family level, and a group called Cool to Rise in Madrid and Barcelona holds workshops particularly focused at families and particularly women-led households, with a lot of community information about Cool, and they really emphasise, and they're doing all of these things to try and put that heat culture concept at the front and centre of how they're doing that community engagement work, rather than after telling someone all about air conditioners. It's leading with culture rather than leading with the tech. I suppose you could kind of compare it here in Australia to the fact that I think a lot of us know that we get really, really cold in winter. I live in Melbourne. I get really, really cold in winter, but we don't think about it in that same way because we think, hey, we live in Australia. We don't have to heat. Cold is not a problem for us, but it really is. And I think that there's a cultural understanding there of how we need to actually adapt our systems and our way of life. And maybe that's a comparable example to what they're pushing there.
Thank you. There's a common theme in a couple of the questions along whose responsibility is it for community energy resilience, and I guess also who's going to pay for it. So, and I guess during the National Natural Disaster Arrangements Royal Commission, there were some key points on how communities, local government, federal government, state government, needed to interact, and also how the critical infrastructure providers needed to interact to ensure resilience, not only of electricity, but also telecoms. So does anyone on the panel have any ideas about where does the balance sit? Should it be community-led, community-driven with support from other people, or does it need to be a top-down approach? We might leave Heather and see if anyone else has any comments, and if no one has any comments, we'll come straight back to you.
Yeah, Jill. So I mean, again, from the work with the ECA, I mean, we really see it as a shared responsibility between community and the other agencies. It will depend on a community by community basis as well, depending on, again, what resources the people that live there, the resources they have, the time they have. I mean, community energy groups, the volunteers, a lot of it is spent their own time. And we've just had another project, which was a 3-year feasibility, community-led for a microgrid in a regional town in Victoria. And after 3 years of going through the process, the volunteers in our community group were rightly exhausted after that whole process, because it's relying on their goodwill, their time, and this is not their day job. And the same volunteers are the same people that sit on 3 or 4 other volunteer groups. So I think it will depend. But yeah, the thing that's certain is that, again, you need to have those groups working together, really on those, and working towards those shared strategies.
I'll just add that I think that there's planning that needs to go on at a national strategic level, and there, we are working towards this year towards a national adaptation plan, and there's wheels turning there. But we're still in this situation where we're not fundamentally. There is a long way to go, and I work specifically around buildings in the residential sector. We know that we're building homes now. The National Construction Code has advanced and it's really important, but we're still building homes based on past climate data. For example, we're building homes based on the climate of 1990 to 2015 rather than into the future. And the work we're doing now is showing that actually the amount of energy that we're going to need and the cooling loads that are going to come as a result of a changing climate are significant. And it's these sort of things which aren't even a question of who pays, it's just a question of forward thinking and being strategic about how we're doing things now. Have to be built in. And look, I don't have a magic answer of who has to do that. We all have to do that. That happens at all levels. But there's things that we can be doing that aren't even about cost. It's about planning.
Yeah, look, I think that sort of high level stuff is really important. Like, clearly the NT hasn't adopted like moving to 7 stars, so that's an issue. And quite frequently, out of convenience, I suppose, the way that the way that the climate zones are looked at in the NT is quite wrong as well. Like, so for example, in the southern NT, we have cold winters. Like, it can get down to sort of -2. Sometimes, hot water pipes freeze and burst. But like literally, and finding a plumber to fix it when everyone's pipes have burst is a bit of an issue. But anyway, not getting distracted by that. If you look at the map of the southern NT from the perspective of the Bureau of Meteorology, southern NT, has extremely hot summers and extremely cold winters, and it's similar to the climate of the APY lands in South Australia. But when you look at the Department of Territory, Families, Housing and Communities, like property management policy, conveniently, there's only 2 climate zones in the NT. The top bit, which is, obviously that Darwin region, and then the rest of the NT, which is described as having hot summers and warm winters. We don't have warm winters. I mean, sometimes we do, but mostly we don't. So that's a problem. So the energy efficiency of, like government-built housing stock in southern NT is lower than the energy efficiency of government-built housing stock built elsewhere in the NT, where it performs a bit better. And also, I mean, it's just, we've got to be working to, and also the disconnection rates in the south are much higher as well, because people are struggling to heat their houses, because public housing, whether it be remote or urban, it doesn't have heating. It has an evaporative air conditioner. And so people are buying cheap plug-in, or using their stove, or using their stovetop. Like, these things are happening. So we have to have a reality check on the climate of now. I'm not even talking about climate change, like this summer, next summer, last summer. And unless we're doing that stuff right, like it becomes hard for the community to develop strategies, I think.
Okay, Heather, you've got 30 seconds.
Okay, culture, learning, relationships, these are deeper things than marketing, comms, campaigning. So community energy groups are doing relationships. It's unfair to expect a whole lot of volunteers to do that, but anyone in this room who's looked at energy efficiency knows it's a market failure because it involves learning, customisation, relationships, and so I've failed.
So we're into negative time, but I just wanted to end by saying all of us are responsible for community energy resilience. And so people in Victoria are probably less prepared. Well, people I know in the suburbs of Melbourne were very much less prepared than perhaps the people of Venus Bay or where I live in northwest Tasmania for power cuts, because we're used to having flaky power and flaky telecoms. We all have to think about it. We all have to think about our own resilience and our neighbours' resilience and our community's resilience. Thank you very much.